started in just a minute. Have a few more folks coming in. Sarah Haggerty, I see your name. Nice to see you here. We're missing, I think, Emily Cole, Heather Donahue, Fortunat Mueller, George O'Keefe, Jeremy Payne. If any of those individuals I just missed, somehow let me know. I'm going to suggest that we get started just in the spirit of keeping true to our ground rules of starting and ending our meetings on time. So good morning, everyone. For those attendees who I don't know, I'm Jody Sapphire. I'm facilitating this Agricultural Solar Stakeholder Group, and I want to thank the group for returning and spending the next 3 hours together again. We're going to start our meeting just a little bit differently this time and sort of jump right in, because we have the benefit of 2 staff members from the Department of Environmental Protection, and I think at least one of them is technically supposed to be on vacation, maybe both of them. So they're being kind enough to fit this group in to their morning. We will have Jim Bayer here until 9:30 and Nick Livesay until 9:45. So I just want to mention a couple of things really quickly, and then I'm going to turn it right over to Nick and Jim to provide some remarks to the benefit of all of you. First is that Nancy, co-chair, got pulled away by the legislature at the last minute. She will be rejoining the meeting, hopefully in the next half hour to hour, as soon as she can. Selena is needing to leave the meeting at 11 o'clock for a federal policy commitment. So, but her staff member, Ethan, will be here for the duration of the call. We'll welcome Jeremy Payne when he arrives, because this will be his first meeting with the group. And just want to remind everyone that these meetings are being recorded, so we're in recording mode now. And for committee members, our stakeholder group members, if you could turn to page 2 of your meeting packet and just do a quick review of the group ground rules, so that when we move into conversation, you can be reminded of how we're sort of agreeing to conduct ourselves. What else? That might be it. So a quick reminder from your last meeting, there was a lot of ground covered at the first meeting, and many of you raised an interest in hearing from the DEP on several items. The first, the sort of the predominant one, was just better understanding the DEP's role in reviewing and approving proposed solar developments over 20 acres in particular, but also where their regulatory role might come into play in other situations. You also asked or had some conversation about wanting to understand the status of a permit by rule process for large solar projects. And then there was also some discussion about the intersection of DEP's stormwater oversight and solar grazing. So when Nancy and Selena and I met with Nick, we just sort of raised all 3 of those issues with him, and he offered to come and speak to all of those. So let me turn it over to both of you, and thanks for coming.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I'm Nick Livesay, the Land Bureau Director at the Department of Environmental Protection, and with me here this morning is Jim Bayer, who's one of our regional supervisors, and Jim has been sort of leading the department with regard to all things solar. He has done a tremendous amount of work for us over the last year and a half, as we've gone from receiving 5 or 6 solar permit applications a year to 150 in 1 year. So he ramped up and has done a great job. And so all the questions that I can't answer, Jim will be able to answer. Right, Jim?
Thanks, Nick.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to touch on I think, the topic areas that Jody mentioned that you folks are interested in, and I'm going to do that in the context of just going through the basic laws that the department administers that apply to solar. And with the exception of one new law that's coming out of this legislative session, all of these statutory programs and regulatory programs are ones that existed before solar, and they apply to all kinds of different development, including solar projects. So the four big laws that Maine has that apply to solar are the Site Location of Development Law, Site Law, the Natural Resources Protection Act, which I'll refer to as NERPA, the Stormwater Management Law, and then the new addition are a set of statutory provisions that deal with decommissioning of solar projects. So that's the only one that's tailored to solar development. And I'll start with site law. So site law governs or applies to larger developments within Maine. And one of the triggers that we heard mentioned by Jody earlier today, and this is the one that applies to solar projects, are projects that occupy more than 20 acres. That's one of the triggers for getting into site law. It's not the most common trigger, but it is the trigger that really brings in solar projects. So if you have a solar development and it occupies more than 20 acres, and by that we look at the area that's sort of within the fence line, any area that's maintained for shade management, access road, and whatever sort of interconnection there is to the distribution network or the transmission grid, depending on the size of the project. All of that gets sort of tabulated and rolled into whether or not you occupy or the project occupies more than 20 acres. So if you do, then you need a site law permit. And that's a permitting program that the department has and had since the 70s. And we get to look at and are obligated to look at a wide range of impacts. The focus is on impacts to natural resources. So we look at impacts to wildlife. We also look at impacts to visual impacts is one of the things that's spelled out in statute. We look at whether the soils are suitable for the development, but that's a focus on whether or not, for instance, some development with a subsurface wastewater disposal system can be built there, and the soils are able to accommodate that system, or the weight of the structures. One of the things that site law does not provide us the opportunity to look at are impacts to agricultural fields, for example. I know that's of interest to this group. So within the sort of scope of looking at natural resources, we aren't able to look at whether or not a project's located in an agricultural field. We would be able to take into account if that field is home to a threatened or endangered species, for example. Then that would certainly fall within the scope of our review. There are other impacts that could occur within an agricultural field, for example, that we look at, and we do that under the next law I'll talk about, and that's the Natural Resources Protection Act. So if site law is triggered by the size of a project or scale, the Natural Resources Protection Act is triggered by the location of a development and its proximity to what are defined as protected natural resources. So what are those? The one that's by far and away the most common in the solar siting context are wetlands, whether they're forested wetlands or wet meadows. We see a lot of in the agricultural context, but wetlands are protected under the Natural Resources Protection Act. And the concept that we have is need to avoid impacts to wetlands to the greatest extent you can. Those impacts that remain need to be minimized. And in certain instances, if impacts remain and they're reasonable, there may be a requirement for some form of compensation, whether that's protecting wetlands elsewhere on the site, somewhere different, or paying into the state's in lieu fee program. So, excuse me. So that's another area where there's an intersection between what might go on in an agricultural setting, but it's, again, not because of agriculture being the predominant use of that area. It's simply if you have a farm field and there's a wetland there, or if another area that we see a common intersection is with forested wetlands and clearing associated with shade management. That's something that the department would look at and regulate. So site law deals with the overall size of a project. It gives us a fairly broad ability to look at the impacts, especially with regard to natural resources. The Natural Resources Protection Act focuses on specific resources. Wetlands are the most common. Vernal pools, or at least those that qualify as significant vernal pools, and the 250 feet around them is another type of protected resource that we look at that comes up in the solar context. Other protected natural resources that we really don't get into so much with solar would include inland wading bird and waterfowl habitat, and things of that nature. So site law, NERPA, and then the next major environmental permitting program that we have is for stormwater. And so the stormwater management law kicks in when somebody disturbs more than an acre. So that's going to be triggered almost certainly with a solar project, unless it's really quite small. So with regard to solar and stormwater, and this comes up with the solar grazing discussion that we've had, the stormwater law focuses on both the quantity and quality of stormwater that leaves the development site. And in the solar context, one of the things that we've seen is that the most affordable way to manage stormwater is not through any sort of engineered or designed retention ponds or anything like that. It's simply through maintaining vegetated buffers, vegetated buffers along roadsides, for example, or avoiding the need to have any sort of treatment or quality control by just maintaining a grass area under and around all of the panels. So if an area around the panels remains vegetated and under the stormwater rules not mowed more than twice a year, then that area doesn't need to be treated, and we don't really look at the stormwater impacts associated with it. So if you let grass grow under your panels and you're mowing it twice a year, it makes your life a lot easier under the stormwater management law, and it keeps costs down. You have to avoid any sort of other best management practices for stormwater management. And so one of the things that we're exploring right now with the Maine Cooperative Extension and folks at the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry is what sort of grazing programs could be implemented under and around solar projects to ensure that a good vegetated buffer and vegetated meadow area is maintained so that stormwater isn't an issue. We're trying to identify, I think we're reaching out to, excuse me, I might get a sip of coffee. All right, hopefully I'm back and better. We've reached out to, or in the process of reaching out to, several solar developers who have expressed an interest in grazing, dual use with sheep. So having the sheep do the mowing, if you will, and not mechanical mowers. And I think we'll be setting up site visits in the near future to look at those particular projects and begin to think about, or think more about, what type of vegetation management through rotational grazing could be used both at these sites, but also to learn and see what sort of factors we should think about more generally, so that when we talk with other solar developers, we can provide them with constructive guidance on what things they need to be thinking about if they want to have a dual use project. So they'll need to be thinking about, I think, the types of grasses that might be planted or seeded at a site after the construction process. There might be this might depend on the type of soils that are present at that site. And so these are the types of factors that we're looking into and working with the Maine Cooperative Extension to understand, so that we can basically, we're interested in supporting dual use and grazing around panels. And we just want to make sure that we come up with a way to make sure that that's done, so that we don't unintentionally create stormwater problems. Back when I touched on the site law, I skipped over one of the things that Jody mentioned the group was interested in, and that's a permit by rule process that the department is working to develop under the site location and development law. So what's a permit by rule process? The simple way of thinking about it is it's a faster permitting process. It's a more efficient permitting process where if an applicant comes in and they're able to make a certain number of demonstrations right out of the bat, and their project has certain characteristics, we know that through these sort of site designs and characteristics that the project's going to be a low impact project from an environmental impact perspective. And so we can eliminate a lot of the review. The theory basically is that, you know, if your project is of type A, B, or C, and you can check certain boxes, we've almost like pre-evaluated that project or that type of project to know that it won't have an unreasonable environmental impact. And so the permitting process can be a much faster one. And so the department's been looking to develop a permit by rule process or expedited permitting process for solar projects that otherwise would trigger site law. And our current thinking is that these would be projects that range from 20 to 50 acres in size. So it wouldn't apply to the larger grid scale projects, but it could apply to sort of the larger distributed generation or smaller grid scale type development. Where every time I'm asked sort of where we are on a timeline with this, I give my best estimate, and if people wait long enough, we'll be past that estimate time. So I'm not sure when we'll be sort of moving forward with public comment period before the Board of Environmental Protection, but I'm hopeful that it'll be at some point this summer. And finally, I mentioned at the outset there's a new solar specific statutory scheme that the department's involved with, and that's a decommissioning requirement. And this is a new law that's been signed by the governor but not gone into effect yet. The easiest way to find actual text is to go search for LD 802 on the legislature's website. Click on the part on the left that allows you to look at the bill or the text, and you can scroll right down to the public law. It's there for its 4 or 5 different sections in Title 35A. The upshot of this is that all solar projects that are 3 acres or size or over, and that number with the size threshold was point of a bit of discussion at the legislature, will be required to decommission. And so that means that they'll need to have a decommissioning plan. How are we going to go about getting these panels and the wiring and the rest of it out of here? And as part of that, how much what is that anticipated to cost? And there'll be a financial assurance component to that to make sure that funding is available when it's needed. Funding would need to be demonstrated at sort of at present, and then in year 15 and every 5 years after that, that financial assurance would be updated. There's also some provision in that the new law so that development on farmland is held to a slightly higher, I guess I would say, decommissioning standard. And in particular, there's a greater sort of depth below the surface that any parts of a solar project that are installed would need to be removed. I think it's down to 48 inches. And there's language in there requiring that some attention be paid to decommissioning in a manner that facilitates farming at that location again, should somebody be interested in that activity. So that's I'll stop there. That's the quick overview, and Jim and I are certainly happy to answer any questions about the department's role with permitting solar projects and how we handle any of these topics, whether it's permit by rule or.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. Jim, was there anything that you wanted to add before we take questions?
No, Nick did a very good job summarizing our responsibilities.
That's great. Okay. So stakeholder group members, just want to make sure that you have ample opportunity to ask questions of Nick and Jim about the DEP's role as it currently stands, what you wish, anything at all, just perspectives that you have on their role. Yeah, go right ahead, Ellen.
I just had a question. I'm sorry. I know you said it, but I missed it. Can you repeat the acreage category sort of spectrum that you're thinking about for permit by rule?
Sure. So it's 20 to 50 acres. So the threshold for needing a site law permit is a project that occupies more than 20 acres. And so that's why that's the bottom number, because if you're smaller than that, you don't get in site law at all. And then the upper threshold that we've been looking at is 50 acres. And that would again be the same, means of measuring. And I think there've been, Jim, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't gone back to look at these numbers, but we've seen 20 or 30 projects probably in that size range. And I anticipate that if we'd had a permit by rule process in place over the last 2 years, we would have seen a lot more. The most common, because the overwhelming majority of the projects we see are distributed generation at this point, so they're smaller. It's just, up to 5 megawatts. The most common project size we see is 19.9 acres. And you see almost none at 21 acres, and that suggests that people are configuring projects to stay under that site law permitting threshold, and so I think if there were an easier permitting path for some of these projects in that size, it's quite possible that folks would either have a few more megawatts or parts of megawatts in their project, which would be, I think, a good thing. Or they would configure their projects perhaps to be even more efficient than they are. That's one of the things that we've heard, is that some projects might be sort of reconfigured in the less than ideal sense from a power generation perspective, for the sake of staying under that site law threshold.
Questions from others. I'm seeing with Nancy not yet on the line, I'm inclined to pull forward this attendee question from Tom, given that he's from DACF. And I'm not sure I'm fully understanding it, but he writes, could Nick comment on LUPC's regulation of solar projects relative to agricultural soils?
Sure.
Great.
So the Land Use Planning Commission, they have regulatory authority within the unorganized and deorganized parts of the state. So we're talking about townships and plantations predominantly, and there are actually 10 or so municipalities that don't administer their own land use program where the LUPC fills in. And so if a project is a site law sized project, so that the department, so 20 acres, if a project is over 20 acres, then DEP would be responsible for permitting that project under site law, and we'd also apply NERPA, and we do the whole permitting process. And the Land Use Planning Commission would be tasked with certifying to the department that that project is in one of their zoning subdistricts where solar development is allowed, and they would also be tasked with making sure that any of their standards that need to be met that aren't duplicative of ours. So that's how we handle any other type of project. And with regard to the decommissioning, we would handle the decommissioning if we're handling the overall permitting of the project. But obviously there's a big difference between 3 acres, which is the trigger for decommissioning size, up to 20 acres, which is the threshold for site law. So if you fall in that range, then the Land Use Planning Commission will be responsible for the approving any decommissioning plan and reviewing any sort of financial assurance that's required as part of that. So we play the same roles. It's just the LUPC will handle that for projects between 3 and 17 acres in the unorganized parts of the state. Otherwise, the department. Hopefully that answers the question.
As I was reviewing the video from the first meeting, I just was conscious for this meeting of wanting to make sure that we have, we hear from farmers a lot this call, and just making sure that we have a balance of perspectives on all of our calls. So I won't put you on the spot at this very moment, but I just wanted to, give a shout out to Nick and Heather and Andy, that as you're hearing these presentations and you're thinking about the impact that it's having on lands such as your own, if it would be really helpful for you to weigh in and have the whole group hear that. So other questions, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, thank you. I was curious to know, are there any other states that are requiring grazing plans prepared by the NRCS for grazing sites that you're aware of?
There are not that I'm aware of, and one of the reasons, and there may be states that do, but I don't know that. One of the things that Maine has that many other states don't is we do have our own stormwater management law, and so many states, or at least some states, will rely solely on either the Environmental Protection Agency or the state's implementation of the Federal Clean Water Act under sort of delegated authority from the federal government. And so I would imagine that if one were applying that framework, that there are a whole range of stormwater, potential stormwater impacts and stormwater associated with development that wouldn't be looked at, or wouldn't be looked at by the state. And so in Maine, we do have a stormwater management law that's separate and apart from the Federal Clean Water Act and any delegated authority that the state has under that act. And so that's why we have a different level of stormwater review in Maine compared to other states. And that's true of all types of development activity, solar and otherwise. And speaking this sort of to, I think, where our approach to dual use here, as I mentioned earlier, we're certainly supportive of finding ways for vegetation to be managed at solar projects through grazing, and I think I'm totally confident that we'll be able to come up with good approaches for doing that at projects where the developer is interested in pursuing that option. What we want to make sure happens is that as that grazing occurs, that good vegetation is simply maintained so that there aren't unintended stormwater consequences.
Yep, great. So Nick A, I'm going to call you Nick A for now.
Thank you, and thanks, Nick, for the presentation. I think it was really great. I tried to dig into it following some of the other threads last night. Appreciating that you're working with the University of Maine, and Nancy, ahead of this meeting, had suggested that some of the folks you're working with there that I know are great on grass farming and rotational grazing. So super resources there. What are you using for some of your modeling elsewhere for decommissioning? This is something that did come up in our previous call here, decommissioning of sites, and sort of folks on this group's tried to look in a crystal ball and sort of wonder what that might look like in the future. Where are you studying decommissioning plans? Is that coming from SMART program in Massachusetts? Is it coming out of Minnesota, California? What are you using for modeling for decommissioning? And I do have some follow-up questions as well.
Sure. So decommissioning is something that is relatively new to the department with regard to any type of development. And where we're approaching and requiring decommissioning, it really started with wind power projects. It's now something that's going to be required for solar development here. And I can think of one other project where the department's required decommissioning. And so where we do require decommissioning, it's where we're particularly focused on where development might occur in greenfield sites because of the nature of that development, and where there is a lower likelihood of redevelopment after the life of that project. And so where you have sort of a defined life, whether it's with solar power or wind power, yes, new panels might be put on, but they may not, which is different from some sorts of structural development where the buildings might be sort of reused by a new tenant for a long period of time. So that's why we're concerned about decommissioning of solar projects. We see a lot of it in greenfield sites, and it's important that after the useful life of these projects that the components are removed. And so the basic principles that we're trying to capture are the same principles that have been applied or are being applied in the wind context, which is, remove that, all the stuff that to put it simply, remove all the development components that you brought in. And that includes transmission, well, not transmission lines, but generator lead lines or collection lines and other in-ground components. And so I don't think we're not modeling the language that we have. I think that's in statute is general enough that it's not overly prescriptive. It does require that these projects be removed. There is, and this came through discussions with the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and I think their interest in ensuring that after a site's decommissioned, that groundwater flow isn't impeded in an unreasonable way and sort of impact agriculture. So that's where there's a certain depth requirement that's built into the statute with regard to decommissioning that's greater on agricultural properties than it is for non-agricultural properties defined as farmland, and greater than what's required for wind power projects. And then I think there's some general language in the statute that acknowledges that an effort needs to be made on farmland, which is defined in the statute, to ensure that farming could resume. And so one of the things that we will be doing and will need to be doing is thinking about, are there particular practices, if you will, for decommissioning that ought to be applied and adhered to in an agricultural setting that are perhaps different than in a non-agricultural setting, where I think the focus is really going to be removing what's there and making sure that the site is regraded and revegetated and not left in such a fashion that erosion and runoff is a real problem. I think that in the context of an agricultural site where folks are worried about topsoils and soils in a way that's different than a non-agricultural site, that's something that we'll need to be thinking about and trying to understand how that should factor into a developer's decommissioning plan, and what we should or shouldn't be looking for as a department.
Nick, did you want to ask a follow-up?
Yeah, there's one. Thank you for that, Nick. Appreciate that. It's very helpful. The only other thing I'd say on DEP here in Maine, the support for dual use, I think it's fantastic. And absolutely, I do not want to come to this stakeholder group advocating for a rush to decisions. I think that's why this group exists, in part to make informed recommendations so the state can make such decisions. But understanding that in some cases where grazing has not yet been green lighted, some of those developers will make decisions to hire landscaping services. And in some cases, contracts will be signed for a number of years to lock in landscaping service, mechanized mowing, control of sites. So I think it could be useful, if it hasn't been done already, to make it known that DEP is studying this and really does want to support dual use, really does want to support grazing, so that in some cases, those projects where grazing may be on hold, at least there's not a promise, but hope that it can be green lighted as a sustainable form of maintaining those sites. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well, we're trying to reach out to there are a handful of developers who we know are interested in particular in solar grazing. And so we're trying to work with those individuals to get out to their properties and see how things look and see what might be done.
Let me put, go ahead, Andy, and then I'm going to ask maybe the subgroup, if you will, that focused on dual use between the last meeting and this one to see if you have any comments at all or questions. So that would include Caitlin and Ellen and Emily in addition to Nick. So go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to follow up on what Nick just said. You know, I'm not advocating for, you know, having water quality issues or anything like that. But so as a farmer who's trying to develop solar grazing as a service that we offer, I just hope that DEP, you know, keeps in mind that if too many barriers are put in place for developers, then they're just going to go the path of least resistance, which is going to be to hire mowing crews to manage their sites. So, you know, keeping the red tape to a minimum, you know, and I guess I'm even curious as to the decision-making process of why, just what it's going to look like for each site to have to, you know, pay to have an NRCS approved grazing management plan put in place, if that is the route that folks are going to take, you know, versus just putting rules in place in terms of, you know, the residue heights or the amount of grazings that can happen a year or the amount of time animals can spend in any one given place in a solar array to ensure that they're being quickly rotated through and that we're not having you know, negative impacts on the sod that's holding the soil in place. So yeah, that's all.
Any comments from what I'm just referring to as the dual use subgroup for the time being, shorthand?
Not really a comment, but just reinforcing what I'm hearing from Andrew and Nick A, that this urgency is really important. I know Blue Wave is one of the developers who's interested in doing this and talking with farmers right now and hoping to get out on one of these site visits over the summer to see what it can really look like in practice. And I think it's really important that we go through these steps and have these conversations, but do want to underscore that we're all trying to get the best outcome here, but we do need to act soon. You know, it's important to get these models up and running off the ground so then, you know, we can see what's working and evaluate as we go.
Thank you, Caitlin.
That was actually, so similarly to what Caitlin and Andy and others have said, I was just curious if there was a timeline for when you all think that you will reach sort of a approved process.
So I don't know what the status of the meeting, sort of the on-site site visits are. I know that we talked with the Maine Cooperative Extension and the Department of Agriculture folks several weeks ago about to get these site visits scheduled. And I think there are two things in my mind why these site visits and looking at a handful of different project locations, why that's important. One is simply to understand these individual projects where we know that folks are interested in grazing. And so what needs to be done there to make that work. I also think it's helpful to look at a handful of different sites because, and I'm not an expert in solar grazing. You know, my family raised sheep when I was a kid, and I remember moving them around a lot because I could do that as a little kid with a grain bucket. They'd follow me, but I'm not an expert on grass or anything like that. And so, you know, we hope to learn from looking at different sites what can be done so that the expectations for a developer or the expectations for somebody who owns a sheep can be hopefully sort of framed so that it doesn't become, at least this is my hope, so that it doesn't become a totally site-specific case-by-case situation. In other words, what are the basic components one needs in their rotational grazing plan? And if there are a handful of sort of items that are required and those are known, then one can sort of build those into their plan for project A, B, C, D, and E without having to sort of have it be overly customized for each one. I think that goes to what we heard earlier. If there are too many sort of requirements and too many barriers, or it becomes too case specific, sort of the value to the developer of having sheep might be lost. And so that's not what we're shooting for. But I think before we can develop any general guidelines, we need to get a better handle on what grazing might look like at some individual projects, and then begin to extrapolate how that might look in general. And so obviously this is something new to the department. I mentioned earlier in 2019 we had 5 or 6 projects, and then in 2020 we were up to 150 of these things being permitted. So it's we're kind of operating at warp speed here, and doing the best we can to sort of figure this out as we're going along.
Thank you, Nick. There's 2 questions, and I just want to direct you to a comment in the chat that Nick Armentrout put in there about there being many working examples and experts to help through the American Solar Grazing Association, which you may already be aware of. But Emily, if I could take you next, and then Nick.
Yeah, that was a well-timed comment, Nick, because I was actually going to bring that exact thing up. I think we want to look to those that are doing this and doing this really well for these examples. And you're absolutely right that we can't have an individualized, site-specific process of planning that would be really difficult. That would slow a lot of things up. But if we can look to some examples as templates and guidelines for ways that this is working really well in other areas, that I think is going to be a really great step in learning what's effective and what makes sense in putting some guidelines and putting some boundaries and some frameworks together for grazing. Sorry for the road noise. Another point I wanted to make is NRCS grazing plan management plans are really valuable. They are also very time consuming to develop. And so when we're thinking about maximum agricultural benefit in managed grazing, that is a valuable resource. I do think implementing one of those for each potential grazing project would be a tricky step to move past to do any of this in a timely fashion. So while 100% I think those are valuable in the grand sort of sense of developing smart agricultural practices, and they have a place potentially in this process, and I'm not saying that we should ignore them, but I was on a caution the development of framework that relies on a lot of other pieces that take a lot of time, or the development of a process that involves that. So there may be something that we can learn from NRCS around grazing management plans that could be used to develop the framework, but requiring that might be difficult to try to do this in a timely manner. And I do think that will spur a lot of folks to just have ground management companies coming in instead of getting this added benefit of having the co-location of sheep grazing on these ground mount solar arrays. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Emily. Nick, I'm conscious of your time. Can you give us 5 more minutes of your time, and then I'll take the remainder of the questions?
Sure.
Great. Okay. So Nick, and then Nancy, and then George.
I'll let Nancy go first because I've been speaking more and she's not.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nick. Emily, I appreciate your comments about the NRCS grazing management plan and the process. Having been in the conversation with Maine NRCS and Cooperative Extension about grazing management plan, the takeaway has been to be high level with general parameters that are based on sound experience. So the intention is not to overprocess this, but to have a template that is versatile and can work for a number of different locations with the sort of main tenants of grazing within that. So I hear you loud and clear, and we will make sure that that doesn't get overly bogged down. But the intention is to just keep it helpful and user-friendly. And I, you know, talking with DEP these last couple of months has been very productive and very helpful. The staff has been very open and welcoming to the information that we have provided to them about solar grazing and all of these other sources throughout the United States. And I'm really excited about, I think, the progress that we are going to make. But, you know, DEP is a regulatory agency that does not deal with agriculture. So they do have to rely on outside skill sets to bring them up to speed and provide them with the confidence that, you know, these grazing management plans are appropriately designed, hence the decision to, you know, reach out to NRCS and see if they could be collaborative. So I think we're moving in the right direction.
Super helpful. Thank you, Nancy. Nick and then George, unless you want to defer one more time.
I will. I've spoken a lot, so I'll let George go.
Thanks.
Sorry, I had to get to my mute button. So, you know, one of the most important things we did in Rumford was to focus on making sure that panels that were installed here met the EPA's requirements for toxicity characteristics leaching procedure. That to me seems like a far more serious concern than grazing management for DEP to be looking at. And I guess my point in bringing that up would be to say, I think that I feel that the focus seems to be on the wrong issue. I think grazing presents minimal issue. The solar panel arrays themselves are probably going to be assistive in control of sediment and runoff, simply because of in-ground insulation in some respects. And you know, given the questions around you know, what can happen when you don't have certified panels on land, I'm kind of curious whether or not DEP is looking at that as an issue. And if that's a side issue, you know, outside of agriculture, I understand, but I do think that it would be helpful to suggest that the more significant threat to groundwater quality, the more significant threat on the environmental side is making sure that you have good panels on the site in the first place.
So I'm not aware that we're focused on at this point, you know, what brand of panel or what either the coating on the panel or the components of it are. But if there's an environmental risk there that we should be looking at, then we will. And I guess I'm looking at Jeremy Payne to see if there are more things that we ought to be looking at with regard to the type of panels that are installed.
Are you guys even familiar with the TCLP and what that does with panels and the fact that there's certifications for them?
Yeah, I mean, we have our waste folks are obviously very familiar with, you know, TCLP testing and leachate and all of that. Yes.
Just for everybody else's benefit, can you spell out that acronym?
Toxicity characteristics leaching procedure, which is an
Thank
EPA. It's a EPA certification.
Great.
And it allows. It essentially certifies that the panels don't degrade at such a rate that they become hazmat.
Thank you. Nick, did you, I'm sorry, Nick Armentrout, did you have a final question? And then I think we're going to let Nick Livesay continue on with his day.
Just one comment. I think that there's from this particular farmer's perspective, I don't really have a problem working with a grazing plan. I don't really have a problem developing planning tools or mapping tools for my property. If I had to do that for a handful of solar sites, that probably would become cumbersome. I think planning is planning. And I think NRCS is a great working example and a collegial USDA organization for DEP to work with. I think if planning and part of an application process and approval process includes submitting grazing plans, I think will be important to define who those specialists, those professionals are that can help develop those plans with the farmers, and perhaps not only point at one direction in the future. I'm not hearing that now. I'm just hearing it of a good example of how this is being considered. I think it'll be important to have plans and to have more than one resource, more than one office help to develop those plans.
Thank you. Well, I think with that, we should continue on with the rest of the agenda. I want to really thank Nick, and if you could pass along the group's thanks to Jim as well. I think he did jump off as planned, but really appreciate your time and information to the group.
Hey, you're welcome. Have a good rest of the morning.
Okay. See ya. Okay, so what we're pivoting to now is we included some additional time in the agenda to just sort of debrief. And this isn't to have the meeting after the meeting, because all of these recordings are public. Hopefully if some good comes out of these next 15 minutes, that it would be helpful to circle back to Nick Livesay with, then all the better. But just wanting to make space for your reactions to what you heard, and whether either the presentation or the answers to questions after the presentation raised any ideas for you on new or modified regulatory mechanisms that could be valuable to explore as a group.
Permit by rule. That's all I'm going to say. I think this should be permit by rule. And any solar farm where they come out and say we're gonna do grazing, it's permit by rule, and they have to file like a 2-page plan, and saying that they're going to do rotational grazing according to national standards. I think that I am really disappointed that DEP is looking at this as hard as they are. I think there are far more serious things in the solar panel side that should be dealt with from aside from agricultural use.
Duly noted, for sure. Any other reactions or thoughts about anything that you heard from Nick?
Hey,
Go on,
go
sorry.
This is Matt. Go ahead, Nick. I'll let you go. Been waiting.
No, I'll wait again. I haven't.
Oh, it's very kind. Yeah, no, I thought just in terms of the sort of checklist of things that we asked DEP to cover based on last meeting, we got decommissioning covered, sort of the grazing plan stuff, which I'm just going to make sure that one of our sites is on there, because Andy, we had talked to you about grazing on the Monmouth site, so I just want to make sure that we're involved there. I think there's a lot of support from industry to get get farmers working on solar properties. So I hope that whatever DEP needs or anybody needs in order for this to be successful, that they're reaching out to Jeremy and us. I think there's strong. I think somebody from Blue Wave mentioned, like we are very supportive. So want to make that work. Also need to be able to get a permit from DEP, and then just generally agree with George's comment about PBR. I think that is a great mechanism to increasing the acreage from 20 to 50 allows the artist to paint on a bigger canvas, right? Like when we do solar design on the sub 20 acres, you're really jamming the project into a small footprint, and you get a lot of shading, and it's pretty inefficient, and it requires that you often impact resources like farmland, I think, in a little bit more. And so I think giving people a little bit broader palette to paint on, or a bigger canvas for the dumb metaphor that I'm using. But that kind of thing, I think is really helpful, because you can bounce off, you can use more of the farmer's you can optimize, I guess, the implementation of solar for the farmer. So I thought it was a good discussion with DEP, and I just wanted to make those couple points.
Great, thank you. May I ask a question to the whole group? And if this is just not helpful, then you can just tell me and we can move on. But this is a little bit of a foreshadowing of the next agenda item, which will be covering in part dual use and the definition of dual use. And as I was reviewing the materials that the subgroup provided, this concept of grazing was not limited to sheep and to lower elevation panels. And I'm wondering how the possibility of cows and higher elevation panels is playing into all of your thinking around how you look at dual use and what requirements would need to be in place for appropriate grazing protocols.
This is where I'm going to go slightly. I didn't raise my hand, I'm sorry, but
Please.
not being a livestock producer myself, but knowing enough to sound like I do. There's a difference with relation to management of larger livestock and their diet and their feed and their needs and crop rotation and rotational grazing, if you will, than sheep, for instance. And not all livestock, for instance, beef cattle, are purely grass-fed in the state. And the length of time at which they would be fed that diet is different as well. So I think you raise a good question that, should there, or maybe not, there be types of considerations for permitting for that type of activity. But I don't believe it's as intensive. I think the department, in working with those types of producers, would actively try to provide the relevant information as to how the benefits for both the agricultural production and the solar production are mutually beneficial.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. Nick, did you have something else that you wanted to add there? And not on my question, but prior to that.
It's just really a comment. There's a lot of discussion on cost to developer, cost to the community. Separate from this, looking at solar, you can't eat mowers and string trimmers. You can't make clothing out of leaf blowers. I think when you look at solar sites and the potential for dual use, you have to also look beyond some of the immediate discussion. In part, as George has suggested, I agree with the concept that perhaps there are bigger problems or bigger fish to fry. I think it's sort of a looking forward. It's what do we want to do with these solar sites? There's a remarkable opportunity, I think, to actually grow our agricultural sector in a thoughtful, mindful way. Not for a second should we rush, but there's a different economy. There's a different community that comes out of grazing for maintenance versus mowing and string trimming for maintenance, or herbicide or pesticide application for maintenance. There's simply a different model that emerges. We should be mindful of stormwater and water quality and too much nutrient in nearby water bodies. But we should also be mindful of what the overall outcomes can be from those dual use sites. And it's just a different scenario when you look at agrivoltaics than landscape services. Totally different.
Thank you. Ellen, go right ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and I think this is sort of a follow-up to Nancy's point, which is in some of our conversations with developers, and it'll be interesting to hear more during Emily's presentation too, but one of the complaints that we have heard about the SMART program and dual use projects is that there are a lot of requirements, sort of like one size fits all requirements, and that there's sort of a greater need for some flexibility. Obviously, having some entity, whether in our case it would be DACF or another regulatory body, but probably DACF, ensuring that certain requirements are met so that we are in fact having dual use projects, but that there's a need for some flexibility so that you don't have to raise panels a certain height if a project is just grazing sheep, right? If there's actually a farmer involved and you're supporting the sort of viability of that farm. And so I just wanted to raise that because that is something that I have heard from a number of developers. And I think that, if we can build in that type of flexibility while still allowing for, the purpose of a dual use project or that sort of mutual ag solar benefit to be maintained, I think that is something that we might want to be thinking about, whether it's sort of more individualized planning by farm, just so that we're not creating greater barriers, which I think people have raised before, to these types of projects than there needs to be, so that this winds up being sort of a really viable type of solar project within the state.
Mhm. Thank you. Any final, George, you go ahead, and then we're going to pivot, I think, to the next agenda item.
The thing that I'm noticing is that we're talking about requirements, we're talking about regulating, farms, and it feels to me like, in essence, introducing solar generation onto farms and dual use applications is putting the farmers in the position of essentially having to do site law on an existing farm. I think that's wrong. I think it's very wrong. Farmers should not be put in a position where if they want to have a dual use application on their farms, that they have to suddenly go through a huge site law process simply because they're going to have dual use on top of an existing use. I actually think that these dual use applications should be the portion of the project that is over existing farmland that is already, legally farmed and everything like that should actually be excluded from consideration under site law. And the only piece that should be taken into consideration on site law should be like land where they're going to, put in the transformers or put in control systems, or actually have an impact on land where that piece of strip of land or whatever is going to be just for control systems. I really don't understand why we're talking about site law when we're looking at systems that are essentially putting in a couple of concrete anchors and then allowing farming to continue beneath the panels. The grazing, I understand a little bit because we're back and forth on, panels and then, are they doing grazing now because the panels are there and that kind of stuff. But I think for true dual use, the best way to get it to occur is to incentivize it by excluding that type of project or writing it out as permit by rule. And I think that's how we give the farming community this opportunity, is if you're going to do dual use, it just gets regulated the same as it always has been as a farm. And we treat it as we treat any portion that's above working fields as no impact at all. I feel I'm really I don't understand why we're talking about this much regulation of existing farms, especially in the dual use application.
I just want to get sort of, can I just sort of see a thumbs up, thumbs down? Do you know how to, all know how to do that on your participant tab, or is that where it is, Ethan? Or is it in chat? Just to show me what you're, if you all are like, yes, 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 I so agree with what George just said, just to give me a sense of where you all are at. Are we finding this? I'm not finding this up and down button. Well, just do it physically. We're all seeing one another.
That feature is not enabled in this right now, so
Okay.
it have to be like a physical.
All right.
Sorry, go old school again.
Okay. Just to give me a sense of if you're like, yeah, I'm not so sure. George is on his high horse. Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you.
I mean, if I could just clarify this is,
Please.
I guess I think it's a bit absurd that we're talking about stormwater runoff when it comes to grazing sheep under solar panels. It's being done on thousands of acres around the world. I'm not hearing horror stories about, nutrient runoff from those solar sites. If grazing, I mean, I came to farming for environmental reasons. I farm the way I farm, focusing on grazing for environmental reasons, including protecting water quality. It's the same way I'm going to farm underneath solar panels. And the fact that DEP is concerned about sheep poop from vegetation that's already on site. It just, it'd be one thing if we were like bringing, if I was going to raise, chickens or something under solar panels, and I was importing a ton of fertility in the form of grain, and then that grain, the runoff from that, the manure from the grain-fed chickens, maybe then, but like we're talking about nutrients that are on site, they're going through a sheep, and then they're going back on the ground. I mean, we basically do the same thing when we mow. It just lies on the ground and rots, and the fertility goes right back into the dirt, right? It's like agronomy 101. So it just doesn't really make sense to me whatsoever.
That's helpful to hear. Okay.
Good grazing management. And we just, again, like listening to I had no idea that there were existing rules, that limited mowing to no more than 2 times a year. Well, why can't we just have existing rules that are blanket rules that are developed input from people who are actually farmers, so that they actually make sense in terms of residue heights or frequency of grazing or impact of grazing in terms of how long animals are allowed to stay in a certain area, how many animal units per acre you can have at any given time, things like this. Just having, not to say that every site is the same, but I would prefer just some guidelines that apply to all solar sites that make sense from an agricultural perspective if we're going to have guidelines like that. This notion of coming up with NRCS grazing plans, even if they are like, there's a boilerplate and all of that, it's just another step. And I just don't see this water quality threat. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay, super helpful. Thank you for, it's helpful when you all are direct. So good. Go ahead, Nancy, and then we're going to pivot to the next agenda item.
I just want to say that, the discussions that we've been having with DEP about grazing management are relatively new, right? And there could be alternative ways. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about throughout this process is, what are the appropriate regulatory or guidance measures that, could be recommended. And if one of the recommendations is, hey, Department of Ag, create some rules, or give the Department of Ag the authority, legislature, to create rules and regulations that are pretty basic surrounding grazing, and we have to go through rulemaking and get the Department of Environmental Protection involved, boom, maybe that's the answer, right? So I just want us to not necessarily see this as a frustrating situation that has no alternative options, like let's work the problem. But I hear what you're saying, Andy, and we've been trying very hard to make this common sense case. And that's why the boilerplate idea was seemingly the right way to go, but there might be alternatives. So I'll just flag that there. Relative to site location of development, we also have to care about whether it's an agricultural field or not, the impacts to wetlands. We have to ensure that, all of those siting parameters are applied, in my opinion, regardless of the intended use. The legislature in the state has placed a value on assessing large-scale development through the site location of development law and the permit by rules, which are an alternative pathway to that. So I'm just saying that there's a rationale for that type of intensive environmental review. But again, if to George's point of, I think George is to say, let's simplify these things. Let's not overcomplicate them. I'm all ears for that and allowing the Department of Ag to play a part in that. But that's why I was like this. There's a reason for site location and NERPA as well.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. I think that's a good ending point then for this conversation. Thank you so much for all of your candor. Why don't we pivot to a couple of the items that came up at the last meeting. We're just wanting to make sure that you're all working from common definitions of particular terms and concepts. And so if you could turn to pages 19 and 20 in your packet and see if you have, Fortunat's not with us today. Ethan is. Ethan prepared this summary for you with Fortunat's input, and just want to see if you have any questions for Ethan or comments about what you read there to make sure that we can kind of move forward with this common understanding. Okay, no surprises for anybody. We'll just have this as a resource moving forward. Okay, then why don't you move to starting on pages 21. And this, I just sort of made an executive decision. This is directed toward the subgroup of what order in which to place these items. I think they were provided to me in a slightly different order, but I thought maybe the punchline should come first, which was just sort of what is the recommendation that the four of you, which is Nick, Ellen, Emily, and Caitlin, came up with as sort of their proposed definition for dual use and co-location. And I do want to make sure that we have a fairly robust conversation about this, because it seems that there is a wide array of terminology and sort of overlapping understandings of what these terms mean, and see whether this group is comfortable with this proposed definition of dual use in particular, as distinguished from co-location.
Is it helpful if I walk through some of this a little bit? And I don't want to take control, Ellen, if you wanted to talk through it as well. I'm just willing to put myself out there to get it going.
I think that'd be great. I mean, we'll always assume at every meeting that everybody has read the packet, but I think for context, maybe it would be great a little bit.
Sure. The four sort of subcategories up above look very familiar to some things that I've actually done with Blue Wave, and the one below is something that we worked together to build, and a good portion of it came from AFT's recent internal discussions on what we wanted to classify dual use as. And even internally at AFT, I can just let you know there's a lot of different understandings of what dual use or co-location is. And so what I shared with our small group, and what part of is here, is a real differentiation between co-location and some of these other terminologies. And co-location is a very broad umbrella term. And so I think we at AFT especially, we're careful about when we say co-location, it really means it could just be that it's a planting that has added ecological benefit, but it's not necessarily an agricultural purposed planting. Co-location on sort of the other extreme is when you could have, the siting for other added benefits, increased shade, and a lot of other things around that area. So what we're actually differentiating here is co-location, which any two things happening sort of at the same time, from minor added benefits and sort of the extreme towards dual use, which would fall under a larger umbrella co-location. Dual use is really around an array that has been built specifically to support agricultural operations on site for the long term. And so differentiating it from being able to add agricultural activity on a more standard array, and saying that dual use has really been installed, designed to enhance and retain the agricultural productivity, number one, both now and for the long-term future. Two, that there's a decommissioning plan at the end so that it can be returned to full agricultural access and use. And 3, that it's something that will support a viable farming operation. That will, support the viability of a farming operation. There is a myriad activities that are incredibly helpful and beneficial and have great positives to them that are co-location. And I'm trying to be careful to speak from my experience, and I'm not trying to put any definitions in anyone else's any other words in anyone else's mouths, but what the American Solar Grazing Association does, I think, is an amazing. I'm gonna pause this while the siren goes by. I had to choose between a house full of kids and an outside full of sirens.
It's fine. We can hear you. It's good.
Okay. So the Solar Grazing Association, I think that it is an amazing use of agricultural activities on regular ground mounted solar. And I think that is a way to improve beyond regular ground mounted solar leaps and bounds. But we would define that as co-location because that's generally on arrays that were going to be built like that. And instead of having ground cover that has to be maintained by a lawn service, you have this incredible added co-benefit of being able to graze sheep, increase productivity of the soil because of that grazing. And then also you have a farmer who has access to much more safe pastured land because of fencing. And so that's to AFT, that's co-location, but that is an incredible example of that. Had that array been built specifically and raised and designed to ensure that there's flexibility in that productivity, and it's not just able to support one type, because we know that farmland will often change the enterprise that it is supporting many times over the lifetime of a field. Taking that next step and then having grazing underneath it would absolutely be dual use, because that was something that was designed purposely to support the farmland and the operation. And so we're trying to internally differentiate that. Co-location has incredible benefits and has a place in a lot of solar, and is something that we think can improve upon standard solar immensely. We're differentiating dual use as something that was really designed and built purposely to protect agriculture in all of its adjustments for now and for the future, and be able to return that back to agriculture at the end.
Thank you, Emily. Any questions about this, or concerns, perhaps just as much concerns about what this subgroup has come up with as a definition?
This is Matt. I'm not sure how to raise my hand. I feel like I'm being rude, but I need a. But I wanted to just make one comment that, dual use is a pretty boutique, currently a very boutique kind of offering. It's just not available, right? Most projects can't afford to do it under most commercial constructs in Massachusetts. Like, we had a session with the UMass team that's working, I think, with a couple of folks in southeastern Massachusetts on dual use. I mean, I think the point's been made previously, but you've got to add a lot more steel to raise panels off the ground. It's just a much more expensive product. So I wonder if one of the objectives here might be or one of the things we could do is just figure out, like, if this is something that we're really trying to accomplish in Maine, and it's really sort of a stated objective, shouldn't we look at the commercial mechanisms for actually getting it done, right? It's not, we can come up with the best sort of agricultural design, or the friendliest sort of solar setup for farmers, but then if no one can afford to build it, it's just not going to get done. And my interest, and I think a lot of people who are participating in this, is like opening up new avenues, new revenue streams for farmers. And making sure that those new, so like practical, action, realistic projects that could get done on farmers' lands in ways that are compatible with existing revenue streams, that's complementary. So I just don't want to forget the commercial reality. I guess that's the point I wanted to add.
Sure. Yep. Thank you. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Morning, everybody. I missed the first meeting. Jeremy Payne with the Maine Renewable Energy Association. Yeah, I think I just wanted to kind of echo what Matt was saying there. And I think it looks like Caitlin's got some good data. I think that probably makes some of the points that Matt was just making on the cost increases. I wanted to just sort of present maybe a little bit of a political reality. For those who don't know, we just basically spent 4 months negotiating small scale solar policy in the Energy Committee, and hopefully the governor's going to sign it at some point here. And it was really industry sort of putting itself on the chopping block and really reducing the size of the program pretty meaningfully, essentially as a response to cost concerns. So I'm happy to be educated, and maybe I will be throughout today and future meetings, but I don't really see how we're going to be able to do what is being described here, which is this all feels good, it sounds good, but it's not going to get done without additional incentives. And the greenfield development costs are a concern politically for Democrats, Republicans, unenrolled, anybody. So I'm not sure how we're going to suddenly be able to do dual use, which is going to require additional ratepayer incentives when we are struggling to get greenfield development moved through the legislative process and allow for companies like Long Road, Blue Wave, and others to be able to permit, finance, and build these projects. So I don't mean to be the wet blanket. I just want to present the sort of political reality as I just experienced it for the last 4 months. So anyway, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yeah, no, very helpful. I didn't notice if it was Ellen or Sarah who raised their hand first. Sarah, and then Ellen, and then George. Thank you.
Thanks, and I definitely appreciate that reality check and that perspective. I think I always come from that sideways place where I'm also thinking about the natural lands as well as the working lands. And I really appreciated this breakdown, this separation of definitions between dual use and co-location, because one of the things we're hearing on natural lands as well is, well, we'll put down some pollinator habitat and we'll be good. It's good for the environment. We can just move on and be happy. And the reality is we're losing habitats, and the reality with farmland is we're losing farmland. And so I think, Jeremy and Matt, you're absolutely right on. We have the commercial piece, the economic piece is huge. That's one of the reasons I asked for some of that information. But that doesn't make the reality of losing those values go away. So I think we need to, that's the ugly hard part that we're all here for, is to figure out, and maybe it's dual use, co-location, other, but they aren't the same. And so I think that's where some of these separations of definitions are coming from.
Yes, and thank you for that. And let's just be clear, what the conversation right now is can we at least be in agreement on what we're talking about? And then the next step is, what do you want to do with it? So I'm glad that you're raising these points, Jeremy. I just don't want you to think that this is first a conversation of, are we in agreement on what we're talking about? So go ahead, Ellen, then George, and then Selena.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this just echoes sort of what you just said, Jody, but I agree. I mean, I think having the sort of reality checks from developers is really important. I mean, part of the reason I raised, I think, the need for having common definitions at least is because I've just had several conversations with developers where I'm talking about, we're supposedly talking about dual use. I'm talking about dual use in more the definition that was just provided to you all. And they're talking about it as planting pollinator friendly habitat. And we're just suddenly, like midway through the conversation, I'm realizing we're talking about two things that in my mind are different things. But I totally agree that this is just a starting point so that we have definitions to be using. And then in my mind, the next logical step is these are additional, to do what we're talking about within the category of dual use as defined here, it does cost more money. So how do we make this then more feasible for developers? What are the sort of mechanisms we need to put in place so that we can see these types of projects within the state? So anyway, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you. George, before I take you, Patrick, Ethan just pointed out the fact that, Patrick, I wasn't seeing you because I'm not physically seeing you. So let me let you jump in here. We haven't heard from you, and then we'll pick back up.
Good. Thank you. First of all, thank you for these definitions. Thank you to the group for working on this. I'm happy to work with these definitions to answer that question. As far as when we talk about what we do with it from here, agreeing with the economics of it, something that I could potentially see happening is because you have, it takes a greater, I'm trying to figure out how to say this. So you will have fewer panels in operations, essentially. So you lose 50% of the equipment that could potentially be assessed an equipment tax. And from a municipal standpoint, where the state is supposed to reimburse a certain percentage of equipment tax that gets exempted in the personal property tax or the business property tax, it could actually become a disincentive for municipalities to write their ordinances in a way that is supportive of either dual use or co-location. So I think that it's important to advocate for the state reimbursing the equipment tax as though we had a full traditional array where you don't lose a certain percentage of equipment in order to allow for the dual use or co-location. I'm not sure if I phrased that well. That might be a little bit muddy, but did the point come through?
Yes, that's clear. That's
Okay.
clear. I love that, I love that this group, we're talking about definitions and everybody's coming up with the solutions. It's great. I'm really glad, and we're taking note of these. So that's great. George, let me take you next, and then Selena, and then we'll go on break for 10 minutes.
So I think the definitions are really good because I definitely understand what is trying to be done. On probably the most important one, retainer enhance the land's agricultural productivity, both short-term and long-term. I believe that I understand the intent, but I think that if you were going to use that language for rulemaking, it's probably not sufficiently specific. In fact, there's a lot of wiggle room in those words that would allow it to be construed exactly in the way that some other folks have already mentioned. So I think you have to use words that very, very clearly state that you're talking about continuing to grow crops, or you're talking about continuing to graze livestock in a manner similar to or in a greater sense than what is already occurring on the land. So that would be my input for you on those definitions. And I also think that the property tax question is significant. And I think that the other way to look at this would be to say to treat dual use in effect as farm appliances or farm equipment. And I think there should be some serious consideration of that. Dual use is a completely different deal. And I think that it should be under a totally different tax regime than standard standalone panels.
Thank you, George. Selena, go right ahead.
So I have 2 points, and the first one I'll make is on the number one that George reference, retain or enhance the land's agricultural productivity. And I'm wondering whether it is worth considering making it forward-looking, so the retain or enhance the land's potential for agricultural productivity, depending on leaving that option for the potential there is one potential change here. And the other is just given the importance of these definitions, as people have been talking about the impact that it will have on the projects, wanting to understand what has been done in other states and how these differ or don't from what is being used elsewhere, so that we understand the context that we are, if we're adopting these, whether this is the kind of what you see everywhere, or whether there's some differentiation that we should consider.
Can Emily, you or Ellen or others speak to that right now, or is that something that we need to follow up on?
I can speak to the differentiation sort of in different regions, if I understood that comment correctly.
Yeah, just one,
okay,
I think.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Since we're adopting these definitions, just understanding, is this what you see in other places, or is there nuances and changes that we might want to consider as we're adopting these?
Sure. So I can speak to Massachusetts, and first, that's where I'm most familiar. And in Massachusetts, I would say that the design that it is dual use under the SMART program does work towards these definitions, you know, sort of ensuring that it retains and protects the production potential of the land, supports viability if it's already farmland and is being leased to farmers. I would say that I don't know of any other states that have put forward a dual use definition or guidelines. New Jersey, certainly, it looks like it's about to occur, but I don't know of any other sort of definitions to rely upon except for Massachusetts right now. I can look to other examples of what folks are calling dual use at research universities and a few other locations and some other developers, and I can see that their design and their structure also tends to be similar to Massachusetts in that it's hard to separate. The design is what we have the examples of more so than these definitions, but the designs also seem to be able to encompass the spirit behind the definition that AFT is used, and a good amount that what you see here, spaced out panels, raised panels, so that there's really an ability to engage the land with machinery and with people and with animals, so that it's retained and protected.
Great, thank you. Nick, I'm going to have yours be the last comment so that we can go on break and come back 10 minutes later.
Thanks. The only thing I was going to add is that this is just a proposed definition. It is absolutely emerging from work coming out of American Farmland Trust. Thank you to Emily. And it's combining some other language from American Farmland Trust and Maine Farmland Trust, and even some concepts from Blue Wave Solar. I'm actually a little bit unclear if we are choosing to adopt this definition. We are proposing this, and as such, I think the spirit of the group was to, why not go for it all? put the concept out there that is the most all-encompassing, what we really want to see. And then let this group pick on it a little bit and perhaps make some amendments or edits to it. So,
yeah, I think that's great. That's where I was going to see if we could end in maybe continuing to ask the four of you to take the comments that you heard and come up with a revision that we could include in the next meeting packet. Would that work for the four of you? Okay. All right, great. All right, so let's go on break until 10:45. We'll come back 10 minutes from now. And Emily, if you don't mind just staying on the line for a moment. Thank you all. Great conversation.
Thanks.
So Emily, if you want to just pull up your slides and we can make sure that we see them, and then I'm going to run off for a second.
Absolutely. Okay.
You could just keep them teed up.
Oh, host has disabled participant screen sharing.
How about now?
Yeah, now it's letting me choose. Okay, so you should be able to see the PowerPoint for the moment, then I'll get it up to.
That's perfect. Ethan, are you able to make me co-host as well, or do you have a limited number? Because it's fine if you can't.
I think I can.
I'm accustomed to being able to turn off people, like unraise people's hands when they forget and that sort of thing.
Yeah, you should be now.
Okay, great. All right, I'll see you all in a minute. Thank you so much, Emily.
Of course.
Thanks, Ethan. Emily, do you want to pull it off screen share for a second? And so that we start back after break, where we see everybody, and then we move to you.
Sure. Sorry, I was trying to enlarge some pictures.
No worries.
Stop share. There we go.
Great, thank you. If there are non-stakeholder group members who are at their computers now that are attending, and you're able to hear me, if you could go into the participant panel and rename yourself so that we can see what your affiliation is. If you have one, if you're simply a public member, that's great too. Really glad you're listening in, but always interested to hear who's on the line. So you just hover over your name and hit the more button, and you can rename yourself, and you can put an affiliation after your name. So if anybody's on the line and can hear that, that would be super helpful. Oh, that's interesting. You don't have the ability. Okay, well, let me see if you do. If you go into participants and you hover and you find your own name and you hover over it, you can see whether there's a more button to the right of your name. And if there is, you can rename yourself. I'm just speaking with public participants at the moment here. And if it's not possible, that's fine. Okay, can't see a list. Can't see, okay, all right, never mind. Good to know. Not allowed in webinar mode. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Giving you a wild goose chase just to... Okay, nice. Hi, Amy. Nice to see you. Great. Okay. Let's see where we're at with with panelists. Straggling back here. Okay. Well, again, in the spirit of keeping on time here, we're going to turn things over to Emily Cole to provide us with some additional information about Massachusetts's SMART program, their solar development policy. You have some materials in your packet, pages 34 to 37, if you want to have those handy for referral. And we've left essentially a half an hour for this, so anticipating that maybe Emily's presentation will be about half of that, and then there'll be opportunity to talk about it, see what relevance it might have for Maine, what pieces of it might be relevant for Maine. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. Okay, can everybody see that full screen?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to give, I don't know, a warning or a full disclosure. I'm a soil scientist, and I'm approaching my understanding of this based upon how I've had to work with developers and farmers and other organizations around the changes in the Mass Smart program, land use categorization, and dual use. And I'm positive that there's probably some developers on the call that may know some of the policy ins and outs a little better than I do, but I can explain some of the land impacts and how those responded to some of the changes in the big land use categorization of the SMART program. So there is a link here for the most updated full regulations for anyone that is interested in reviewing those. This is the red line, so you can see the changes from the last version to this version in that link. So the brief timeline here for the full scale, which I think is helpful potentially for Maine, is that in spring 2017, that's when the draft regulations were filed. And that for the SMART program, that was for 1,600 megawatts. Then in winter 2018, so very, very early 2018, the initial competitive procurement was announced and was put forward. And as part of this, there was going to be a 400 megawatt review as part of the early planning of the SMART program. And that 400 megawatt review came pretty quickly. By fall of 2019, they put forward the 400 megawatt review straw proposal to make changes based upon really just about the last year or so, year and a half or so of the SMART program. They reached this 400 megawatt point. One of the biggest changes overall in fall of 2019 was that they actually doubled the size of the program, or proposing to double the size of the program, which they eventually did. So from 1,600 megawatts to 3,200 megawatts for the SMART program. But they also revisited and revised the land use categories during that. And they proposed changes to the ASTGU. I'm going to, for ease, refer to that as the dual use guidelines. It's the Agricultural Solar Tariff Generation Unit guidelines. They did propose changes to the ASTGU, and ultimately they reverted back to the original guidelines, and we're sort of in a moment of hold, waiting for new revisions to potentially come. After the 400 megawatt review, there was opportunity to comment. Certainly a lot of discussion happening in the community, and then in summer 2020 was when the new regulations were filed that are now any new projects coming into the pipeline or any projects that hadn't met a certain point along in the process are all subject to the new regulations. And then this past fall, there was, after the quick reversion back to the original guidelines, the dual use guidelines were presented, new proposed guidelines were presented in a straw proposal. There was a comment period until the end of October, and we are awaiting the final decision on those changes. So this is the sort of the broad major timeline pieces, and I'll go through some of these and the impacts where they were before and what has changed. So the guidelines regarding land use siting and project segmentation, they were revised slightly in July of 2020, and then they were revised even further, and this is where we're at now. And just want to clarify something that under the for the purposes of the SMART program that previously developed, if you see that in any of the language, means that there was no existing, or sorry, got my picture of everybody here is covering my words. Here we go. For the purposes of this, previously developed shall mean having pre-existing pavement, construction, altered landscapes. Anything that is previously developed is not something that is an agricultural use, and it is not a preserved natural area. They're really thinking more around like built landscapes versus developed from forestry into agriculture 100 years ago is not what they're considering as previously developed. And the original land use was broken up into 3 categories, and I'll go through these a little more depth in a moment. But category 1, there was no greenfield subtractor. So this is a rate penalty for the production on site. Category 2, there is a greenfield subtractor. It was multiplied by 2.5 basically when the revisions occurred, going from 0.0005 to 0.00125. And then category 3, there was a greater greenfield subtractor, 0.001, so 1/10 of a cent per acre, going up to 0.25 cents per acre. I'm sorry, away from acre and into 0.25 cents per kilowatt hour per acre impacted. And the area impacted is really around the square footage of the PV panels. And some of the questions that would organize the siting into these different categories is whether or not it's on land and agricultural use, size of the system, how it's mounted, is it ground mounted or is it a building mount, existing condition of the land previously developed or not, and is there zoning. And this link is another place where you can find all of these in greater detail. So here are the initial land use categories from the SMART program. So this is not the revised versions. One thing that is included here is a revision in terminology. Category 1 land use, you can see under A, it was broken up into agricultural, and then B, non-agricultural. So for category 1 agricultural, it was located on land that was in agricultural use or important agricultural farmland that meets one of the following categories. Just a slight note that previously it said land in agricultural use or prime farmland. And there was a revision even to the old guidelines, which is important because if a project was within the pipeline to a certain point, it would still follow the old guidelines. However, they made the adjustment from just saying prime farmland to important agricultural farmland, which includes unique and farmland of statewide importance. So previously, if you were on land of statewide importance, farmland of statewide importance, it did not fall underneath that category, but it does now. And so that would be our dual use, the ASTGU would fall into this category 1. It's also any building mounted, floating solar, canopy solar, or sizes that were no more than 200% of the operational load of the agricultural facility. So that's all category 1. That meant there was no subtractor if your project met any of these particular categories. Category 1 non-agricultural, there also is no subtractor. And this is for anything that is not on agricultural land in agricultural use or important agricultural farmland. So it doesn't fall into any of those siting locations, and it's one of the following. So ground mounted that are small, less than 500 kilowatts, building, brownfields, landfills, sightings, floating, canopy, and anything that is on land that has been previously developed that is between 500 kilowatts, which is half a megawatt, and 5,000 kilowatts, which is our 5 megawatts. And then the other piece of this is any of those sized units that are being cited in something that has been zoned locally that explicitly addresses solar and power generation, and it complies with that. So none of these receive any subtractor. And the ASTGU units actually receive an adder because of the added costs associated with building projects that meet the design requirements of ASTGU, which was we talked about previously before. There is definitely an added cost to building projects that meet those requirements. Here are the revised criteria, and what you can see here is that there is, in the revised one, there is no category 1 agricultural. So what they've done in the revision is taken a look at the category 1 non-agricultural. So this is any of the projects that are not located in land and ag use or important farmland will be designated as category 1 non-agricultural. So here that means that this is where there's no subtractor anymore. Category 2, it did not change much at all overall in terms of some of the requirements here, but there is a subtractor for this. So what you'll see here is that this is actually more like the category 3 from beforehand. And let me just move up briefly. So maybe I have it later on, I apologize.
No, you do have it there.
Okay. Okay, so there was a category 2 and category 3 up here. And now if I'm gonna, sorry not to make anybody dizzy, go back down here. we have category 1, category 2, and ineligible in the revised versions. So in the ineligible, we've actually, what we have here is an increase in some lands that were included. Previously, it was critical natural landscape that was going to be ineligible. And now what we have is inclusion of priority habitat, core habitat, and designations that are based off of mapping that was done in Massachusetts around these specific types of habitat. I'm not an expert on what these habitats are, but what I can say is that based upon these updated categories, what you see here is that there's far less other greenfield siting that can occur, significantly far less. And so if we have greenfield siting that's going to occur, it's going to start to fall in the agricultural landscape, and you can only site on the agricultural landscape now if it is ASTGU, if it is the dual use. So here are category 2 land use is the lesser of the two subtractors. Category 3 land use is the greater. And basically anything that is still zoned for commercial and industrial use, has not been zoned for commercial industrial use, and then it's on the ground, but it's not in one of the categories that is disallowed, is category 2. And then anything that is not in category 1 or category 2 falls into category 3. Sort of a catch-all. Here, I think is a clearer version of this. Originally, the ineligible land use was permanently protected open space and wetland resource areas, properties that were in the state register. The revised added landscape, that's the priority habitat and the core habitat. And now parcel with at least 50% of its area designated as priority habitat or core habitat, unless it meets criteria of category 1 land use. And ASTGU is the one of the few places where we can still see greenfield siting. And this is for after the publication date. If there is a project that has not met a certain point in the pipeline, it now has to follow these revised additional ineligible land use guidelines. If it was in the pipeline to a point where I believe it was different for the type of project, but you had a letter of predetermination, you had a interconnection agreement, I believe is perhaps where you were able to stick to the old guidelines. Perhaps there's a developer that could, if that's a question, could clarify that for us. And then lastly, again, after the publication date, what we see here is that if you have, if you're looking for a statement of qualification for the additional 1,600 megawatts that were opening up, then you had even more ineligible lands. So any land that was a critical natural landscape and any land that was 50% of its area in its critical natural landscape is now subject to those ineligible land use guidelines in the new 1,600 megawatt portion. So there were some performance standards that were also put forward here if you were going to site on farmland, because we know that we're trying to protect the agricultural production, MDAR and DOER, Mass Department of Agricultural Resources, and Department of Energy Regulation work together and develop some guidelines for anything that would be sited on farmland. And these have not changed in terms of some of the broader frameworks on siting this way. And what we see are really more around best practices of building. So no removal of field soils, having, trying to keep any existing leveled field as minimally disturbed as possible, not disturbing if you can, really trying not to grade the ground where you don't need to grade it. If there is anything that has been graded, you're returning any displaced soils back to the area. You can only use screw type or driven post support. So no, we're not looking at any concrete footings for anything that's sited on farmland. Trenching for electrical really has to be done in a minimally disturbing way. Again, any soils that are displaced need to be recovered and returned. No concrete or asphalt in the mounting area, only where required for code, such as transformer and electrical gear pads. Addressing any existing soil water concerns and avoiding negative impacts to soil and water conservation. So that's really talking about implementing the BMPs and ensuring that if there is a resource concern in place already, that is addressed. Limited use of any sort of geotextile fabrics, and then maintaining vegetative cover to prevent soil erosion. Those have been fairly consistent throughout the program. And so the last thing around within the guidelines for the ASTGU for the dual use was that there were proposed changes about a year and a half ago that were received with, there was a lot of concern around the guidelines. They increased the restrictions on how much can be shaded, and they added in productivity standards for production on site. And there's a lot of, I would say, unfamiliarity with how you would go about developing productivity standards. We don't know enough yet about how to evaluate land use efficiency with dual use and various crops, I think, to be able to instill land use production standards for lettuce versus grazing. How do you measure the land use efficiency when you're grazing crops? Or excuse me, when you're grazing land. So after several listening sessions, stakeholder conversations, the proposed changes to the dual use guidelines were removed and they reverted back to the original. And these are those original guidelines. So basically there's a design and a farm plan that has to be approved by MDAR with support from University of Massachusetts Extension. And that means the design cannot interfere with the continued use of the land for agricultural purposes. It has to optimize balance between generation of electricity and agricultural productive capacity. It has to be a raised structure with height enough for labor and machinery as it relates to agricultural activities. The crops to be grown have to be provided and reviewed by UMass Amherst Ag Extension Services for compatibility. There's a quick point I'll make on that is UMass Extension was written into the guidelines. However, UMass Extension does not have really a large capacity to review these as many extension services. We know they struggle with really just having enough staff hours to do their own work. And so there's been some difficulty here in trying to work farm plans through the approval process because of really just kind of lack of eyes to review them. There's annual reporting of the productivity of the crop. So there's no requirement to meet, but there is reporting, and then it includes herd size, any success or potential changes. And then on the last panel here, you can see these are some of the more technical points. So you need to, for panel height, it's 8 feet for fixed arrays, so the leading edge, the lower edge. And it has to be 10 feet for tracking arrays. And there's a maximum direct sunlight reduction of 50% on any of the square feet on the project site. So it limits how close these panels can be together, how close the rows can be together. And it also, if you want to meet that 50%, raising the panels is really one of the biggest impacts to ensure that happens. And just a couple of visuals here. The one on the right is the first dual use array to be connected and operational in Massachusetts and once in Mass. It was not quite completed. It was just about finished construction in this image, but you can see the posts, see the added height. The picture on the left is actually an international example, just a different design that I wanted to put forward to show that there are ways to really do this with providing quite a lot of open space underneath. The last piece of context, and then I'll pause, is when the SMART program began, shortly after, there was a report put out by some researchers at the Harvard Forest. And they showed that in Western Massachusetts, the 3 counties where the Connecticut River bisects these 3 counties, so the Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts, together 70% of solar siting that had occurred in the few years leading up to the SMART program, in the first year of the SMART program, 70% was on forest land and farmland. And so that study, I think, matched the sentiment and concern for where solar was going initially in Massachusetts. And the adjustment of the siting guidelines on where it could sit, and the removal of farmland as being able to have a greenfield subtractor and not be dual use, to now, if it's going on farmland, it must be the dual use version only, has caused, a reaction that sort of runs the gamut, depending on sort of where you sit on this issue. And I would say similarly with the changes in the critical natural habitat versus core habitat changes. So there's been really much greater restriction on green fields in the updated regulations. So I'm not, for me, it's not my place to give you opinions one side or the other, but that is just the reaction that occurred. Certainly concerns that now is too restrictive, we're not going to get enough solar in Massachusetts to, that is now it will actually protect the natural landscape and force solar to where, it may be less disruptive naturally, or to move it to some more preferred sites like brownfields or rooftops. Those have been in place since October. July, they've been finalized and in place. And so there's still a little bit of adjustment moving forward to see how that will change siting. That's where we are right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily. Let me open it up for questions or comments that people have about this information on Massachusetts program. Ellen, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emily. That's super helpful. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the reactions to the requirements for dual use, because obviously there are quite a few requirements, and sort of how that's played out in terms of the development of dual use projects within the state.
Sure. I think the reaction to the initial requirements was, well, that's a lot. And then when they became more restrictive, the reaction was, hey, let's go back to the first ones. But the thing I think that is different and unique in this case is that, there's no getting around them. And so while the initial reaction was that that's a lot of change, that's a lot of money, that's a lot of adjustment to make this happen, I think that there has been, people understand now though that the 6 cent per kilowatt adder is, and I would like developers to please make sure they chime in on this, seems to be sufficient though to overcome those additional costs and the added barriers to working with farmers and dealing with the design. What I do know is, in speaking to folks at Mass Department of Agriculture, is that these guidelines, a lot of projects are just going right up to that line and maximizing solar generation and just meeting these. And so I think there's some wish and hope in MDAR and UMass Extension that there could be more creativity in some of the plans that are being proposed, but because it is restrictive to maximize generation, and obviously this is an enterprise to generate profit, right? So you're really trying to maximize solar generation here. There's that side of, I'd say, the agricultural community wishing that there was some different versions coming forward from folks who are more interested in preserving the agricultural side of this. But when you have a regulation and that's what's law, that's the barrier people are going to move up to. When the new land use siting categorizations came out, there was an influx of emails to AFT saying, we know that you seem to understand about some of this dual use. We'd like to learn how to do it. And so that reaction was more about if anyone is going, if they're going to try to get into the Mass Smart program, they now have to learn how to work around dual use and trying to understand how to do it. And there were certainly some forward actors that were already on the ground doing this, like Blue Wave. And there were a lot of folks trying to get into the game that now needed to learn it. So that was an interesting reaction to the adjusted land use categorizations. But the proposed changes to the dual use, I think there was sort of an uproar. And so that they moved back to the standard ones. And now we're waiting to see what DOER will present as the new guidelines based upon comments that were submitted last fall.
Does anyone else on the call have experience working with the Massachusetts program and want to weigh in with their own perspective on? Go ahead, Caitlin.
Yeah, I'll just underscore from the developer perspective a lot of what Emily said. The changes to the land use guidelines are correctly characterized that the only way to do greenfield development now is by doing dual use on agricultural land. So Emily's right that everyone who has a project in SMART who doesn't want to lose that project has to figure out how to make it dual use. So that's shifting a huge pipeline of projects to this very strict approval process that, again, like Emily said, is going through a very small organization that doesn't usually have regulatory oversight, this being the UMass Agricultural Extension. So I think from our perspective, there's a lot of uncertainty, because the guidelines aren't finalized yet for dual use, so we're not really sure what rules we're adhering to. Secondly, just because a lot of the plans haven't been approved yet, that we're uncertain what types of plans will be approved, what UMass and MDAR are looking for in terms of specifics. And it's just a lot of questions floating around when we want to be doing the right thing. We want to be meeting a very high standard for what can be done on these farms. And there's just a lot of unanswered questions still, even when this is like the farthest dual use program in the country so far.
Sure, thank you. I'm happy to have us stay in this conversation. You'll note that the next agenda item really is unscripted. It's to make sure that you have the opportunity for open discussion. I'll take you in just one second, Matt, about a couple of other items in your packet that Ethan prepared. I want to make sure you have time to look at that. But if there are elements of the Massachusetts program, with all things being different between these two states, the markets and everything else, that you all feel could be useful in Maine, it would be helpful to hear that. So just bookmark that and let me take Matt's comment.
Yeah, thanks. I figured out how to raise my hand. So I did just want to note that on the ratepayer impact side, just a little bit on the context that Jeremy gave, I did look at some numbers for Massachusetts, and the first two tranches of the SREC program cost Massachusetts ratepayers about $3.1 billion. So just, mindful of like the 6-cent adder is good in terms of sort of the mechanism, the market mechanism, to, in my opinion, good in terms of driving the right outcomes in terms of farmland preservation and habitat and other good things for farmers, but it is expensive. So thinking about those differences that you just mentioned, Jody, the between the two states, obviously we just went through a big go around with the Maine legislature on the ratepayer impacts of net energy billing. So just mindful there. But then I think it does present an opportunity, and maybe this is for the next topic, to look at like the land use standards in the context of a PBR or a procurement, where you could use some standards that this group recommends, for example, to incentivize new commercial constructs for Maine, as well as regulatory constructs that would drive developers to the right sites. So just for context, future.
Great. Emily, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to emphasize that absolutely dual use is an added cost, and that added that rate adder is something felt by the ratepayers. And I think that while I am not the economist on here to answer that sort of aspect of it, what I can say is, from thinking from a farmland protection and thinking from a soil scientist and sort of a climate scientist aspect, the benefit that can be received from maintaining land underneath the solar panels as an additional potential carbon sink, and the added benefits of food production and protecting the local food economy. I think that there is a way to put a financial number to that. And while I'm not one to know what that financial number is, for a long time, I was a ratepayer in Massachusetts. I just recently moved out. That added rate is something that, personally, my opinion is that it's worth paying for me to pay it because of my opinion and my concern around the environment. So I do think that there is a way to put a financial number to some of the added benefits that dual use provides. Is 6 cents, the give and take, appropriate for that? And again, I'm speaking from someone, speaking as a white woman of privilege, that I can afford to pay that. And so there's certainly a lot of conversation around the ratepayers and what added costs can fairly be shouldered by ratepayers, for sure.
Thank you. Any other comments about Massachusetts? Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, just a small technical question, probably for Emily, if you don't mind. Why is it that Massachusetts chose not to allow the riprap ballast as a securing mechanism? Is it soil compaction, or did they just not consider it? Do you know?
I don't know the reason why it's not considered, and that's the large rock, right? That's the riprap. Do I have that correct? Sort of the larger than gravel. Okay. I do think that it's likely because of the compaction issues. Also the ability to remove and work around those that when you're trying to farm, I think would be logistically difficult beyond just the soil impacts. But I don't know for certain. That's just my initial thoughts on it.
Thank you. Andy, go ahead.
I was curious to know, now that the focus is on dual use projects, has that had any impact on the lease rates that are being paid to landowners that lease to solar developers? For anybody who has experience with Massachusetts, I guess.
Yeah, someone else would be better suited to answer that for sure than me.
I can answer that. Not necessarily the lease rate itself is always impacted, but at least on the projects that we're modeling, we always do a direct farm subsidy payment there's some language about this in the one pager I provided, but essentially to cover like added farm insurance, custom equipment that's going under or around the panels, some added production cost that might be on the back of a farmer. Like it's a really individualized plan, and for that reason, like developers are prepared to pay more to farmers to make sure that they can still do the farming they want to do on site.
I have another not related to dual use necessarily question about Massachusetts, but since we're talking about Massachusetts, so from our last meeting, there was frustration expressed about, well, how do we try to focus these projects on brownfield sites and the limitations of transmission to those sites? I was just curious, have there been any programs in Massachusetts to cover the costs of increasing transmission to those sorts of sites to try to relieve the pressure on farmland, or is that not happening?
There's no additional program for that in Massachusetts that I'm aware of. I think, there are issues around brownfields and access to brownfields, and brownfields, even though there might be hundreds of them, a lot of them are very small. Sometimes they're only half an acre, and those are obviously not going to be something worth being developed sort of at a large rate or a fast rate. So if this is something for a future time, there's some information developed from the Smart Solar Siting program around siting in brownfields that I'd be happy to share in future meetings.
Well, I'm going to suggest that we pivot, and we can circle back to this if it makes sense to do that. But I'm conscious of the fact that between the last meeting and this meeting, we put out a follow-up email with some additional information, and that included the additional mapping tool that Maine Audubon is essentially launching now. You may or may not have had the opportunity to dig into that, but I think this kind of follows on to the question that Andy had around, is there mapping information that would be useful to you as a group, because you may want to explore whether it's logical to try to come up with mechanisms that would encourage solar siting on some of these brownfield, gravel pit, whatever, non-agricultural sites. And if that is an interest area, what sort of information do you need to do that? So I just want to acknowledge that you got that resource, that it exists, that and that I won't speak for you, Sarah, but my sense is that you are open to generating materials that would be useful to this group, pulling data from that resource. Just want to get reactions. Well, or Sarah, you go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, absolutely, I'd love to hear from everybody. And I think what you can see if you play around with it is the limitation that we have with good spatial data right now. Even landfills are not defined as polygons, they're defined as points with no information on how big they are. The information is usually sort of before X date or after X date. For some of them, there's better information. Brownfields are points, and they could be an oil spill in the middle, a gas spill in a gas station in the middle of the city. So real limitations on data, but happy to push to get better data. And just a quick point on the Massachusetts versus Maine, because I actually worked on those core habitats and critical habitats and priority habitats. One thing to remember is they were not created for solar siting. That was not the intent. They'd been around for ages before that. They were just used. And that Maine is 22 million acres, Massachusetts is 5. Maine has 1.3 million people, Massachusetts has 7. So very, very different places. And so I would love to see us, I love what they did through SMART, but I'd love to see us creatively take what works for Maine and maybe go better.
Mm-hmm. At each meeting, you're going to have sort of decision points to make as far as what's going to be most useful for you to dig in more deeply. You could be going down one route that just says, we want to do everything we can to incentivize siting on everything but agricultural land, prime farmland and soils of statewide importance. And so work on incentives, work on identifying those large sites that are brownfields or gravel pits or cap landfills. Or maybe or you could be prioritizing ways to come up with citing criteria and for projects that occur on farmland, and in much the same way that it sounds like Massachusetts has done. And I'm trying to get a sense at every meeting as to where you think it's going to be most productive to spend more of your time. So let me just open it up for general reaction, because this is really, and Matt, do you have your hand up for now or for earlier?
I did
Okay,
have
go
it
ahead.
for now. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm figuring out how to do this. So I guess I just wanted to ask a question. I feel like there's a little bit of a framing of the problem that would help. Or I guess it's maybe a question for Sarah. When I looked at the summary of the findings, looking at kind of how many projects have been cited in, on farmland and sort of unfragmented habitats and things like that, it gets the takeaway feels like there's a problem, like solar has been cited in the wrong place. And I just want to, generally, is that the conclusion one is that what people generally feel like? I'm not sure what the answer is, but I know that it's going to be very hard to shift people away from, open land, and particularly prime farmland is like a lot of it is just not in farming today. So, a lot of times people don't see that as a restriction, and I'm not sure they should for solar development, because it's often land that a farmer's not using. It's unproductive land for them. And so it's an opportunity for them to kind of monetize ground that they're not otherwise monetizing. So just a couple, I wanted to kind of better understand, do we have a problem with respect to citing, or is this and then B, are we thinking about further limiting solar development on land that farmers would generally like to develop, namely prime farmland that's not in farming, and we're proposing to we're saying hey, we should take that opportunity away from farmers. I guess I have, in terms of the next steps, trying to frame a little bit of the thinking there.
Understood your question. Yep. So even though Jeremy, you raised your hand first, let me take Sarah first, just because it was kind of directed to her, and then to you.
Yeah, thanks. And perfect question. That is one of the things I've started digging into, and it is absolutely true that prime soils are not always being farmed. Again, there isn't a ton of great data on actively farmland that's actively being farmed right now, but I found some sort of coarse layers that that I'm using to try and get those numbers, looking at prime soils in active agriculture as sort of the highest bar, and soils that are sort of under, the woodlot on the same property. And so I am trying to pull some of that information together. I think there was another great question that came out afterwards. When you say it intersects, if a project intersects with soils or active agriculture, is that like a quarter of an acre off of a 20-acre property? And so those are some of the other things that I'm trying to look at. I also just got a new file on Friday with additional projects that have come in. So I'm trying to update all of that with the latest information, but hopefully I'll be able to pull some of that together and share some of that with you before our next meeting as well.
Great, thank you. Jeremy, go ahead.
And thanks. And Sarah, you may be answering the question I was just going to ask, and I will confess up front that I did not review the first meeting's minutes and the materials that were distributed. So apologies in advance if I'm about to ask a question that has been asked and answered previously. But sort of piggybacking kind of on what Matt was saying, is I'm still trying to figure out what are the number of acres that we're actually talking about, and what are the development pressures on those acres? Because that's the thing I was asked this question a few times. Again, sort of my frame of reference is almost always going to be the legislature and policymakers. And I was asked that question a couple of different times. Well, we're hearing that there's all these development pressures on prime agricultural farmland. And I just kept saying, well, I actually don't know that to be true. I don't know it to be false, but I'm just not sure. So if we haven't already asked that question, and if there is a way to gather that data, maybe first and foremost, how much prime agricultural farmland is there in the state? How many acres? Do we have it mapped? Do we know where it is? And do we have a data layer that shows that there are now, a whole bunch of yellow flags representing solar projects that are under construction, planned, under development, and under consideration? I think that's what I'm trying to figure out, because maybe to your point, Sarah, if we do have a bunch of sites that are in a corner of a 20-acre field, maybe it's not something that we need to get exasperated over, but maybe if it's 19.75 acres of a 20-acre field that's being impacted, okay, maybe we do have a conversation that needs to be initiated. But I still don't feel like I personally have a great answer to the question of what is the development pressure we're trying to alleviate or identify and push away from. I candidly just don't know the answer to the question. I'm curious if others may.
Sarah, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, I don't have those numbers right off the top of my head, but I can definitely share what I went over last time. And again, with these additional projects, we can look at that too. What I've seen in looking at the data, so prime soils are mapped and identified by USDA, NRCS. And so there's a layer out there. It's a little harder to get where exactly are active farms and even what's the project footprint for a solar development. So what I have are the footprints that have been mapped that have come through DEP, but most of them are actually the parcel. Some of them are the limits of work. Some of them, very few of them are just sort of points on a map. And so having that really accurate spatial data is a big limitation, but I can definitely get you the some of those raw numbers and definitely the biggest pressure seems to be on active agriculture on prime or soils of statewide significance. Yes, I would say that is true out of the 22 million acres in the state.
Thank you, Andy, and then George.
Just to follow up on that question, something that I have been asked and have been wondering, it'd be great to understand the number of acres that we expect to be impacted by solar development in the state, in order to meet the renewable energy goals that have been laid out. I think that would really help just, to answer that question as well. Like how many hundreds, thousands of acres are we gonna need to put panels on to meet these goals?
Thanks. George.
So, I think one of the problems we have is that we're continuing to talk about terminology where we're talking about prime farmland soils versus actual active agriculture. And I think this is a really serious issue in this group because we've got one point of view where we're saying we're trying to preserve prime farmland soils. And we have another point of view where we're saying we're really worried about active agriculture specifically. And I do not like the sense that I've got that I'm starting to see, which is we have people are starting to talk past each other, I think, quite frankly, and that there's a desire to conserve prime farmland soil, which may not be an active agricultural use whatsoever. I mean, a lot of land that is not an active agricultural use, but we're saying it's prime farmland soil. So there's a terminology problem here. And the second issue, I think, is we are literally, I feel, watching two regulators potentially suddenly have an opportunity to regulate farms in a way that they don't right now, because there's this new development activity and suddenly farmers are being told, oh, well, you have to do soil conservation, you have to do a whole bunch of management or more intensive management on your own farms, which are legal right now, than you did before, because you have this supplemental opportunity for income. So that's a problem. And then the other issue on top of all that, which has not come up much to my discomfort, is questions about forests, which are supposedly within the scope of this group, but we're talking about habitat and completely different things. So I'm very displeased that prime farmland soils are being discussed in the same framework as working farms. They are two totally separate things. There's millions of acres of prime farmland soil, and there's quite a bit less in active agricultural use. And I think it's wrong, and I think it's a disservice to the public to do this. We're talking past each other on some really, really important stuff. And And so, you know, I thought I'd share that sense. You know, I think that I feel like this group also on the framing side, to speak to what Matt was saying, we are framing the questions around requirements and implied requirements or needs for regulation. And I'm just like, nothing that I've heard here so far, other than maybe some soils questions, feels like we need more government regulation on these small businesses. I mean, and I'm a big believer in water quality. And none of this feels like we need more requirements on small farms.
Thanks for your comments, George. So if we need to go back to the primary purpose of this group, we can. My understanding is that the goal here was to do everything possible to preserve prime farmland and soils of statewide significance, statewide importance, forgive me, while at the same time promoting solar power production to the greatest extent possible as well. If this group believes that that is far too broad a mandate, and what we really need to be focusing on are strictly the active farms. So finding those out, you know, identifying the farms, the soils that are being actively farmed right now, and coming up with mechanisms to ensure their protection. Let's hear that. But as of the beginning of this process, my understanding was that the goal was broader than that. Thoughts on that? Go ahead, Nancy.
Thanks. I would err on keeping this conversation broad while flagging the concerns if we remain too broad in our definitions and don't become more precise in our recommendations. There's over 700,000 acres of prime soils that are mapped in this state. I don't think anyone would want every single acre of that to be locked up for a lot of the reasons that we've discussed today. But I also think that agriculture is dynamic in this state, and the numbers of farms active are going to wax and wane and increase in the future. As Commissioner Beal made in her introductory remarks earlier this month, you know, there are climate change goals that we are also working towards with open lands that need to be part of this overarching conversation too. And we are looking to the future for additional farmland opportunities in this state. The future of farming is new farmers and farmland conservation. So I don't want to be overly restrictive in saying we have to find every single existing farm in the state, and that would be the cohort, and that's it. And so I think there's room. It's not where we are today, but it's not all 700,000 acres as well. So that's what comes to mind.
Thank you. Patrick, did you have your hand up for now?
Yes, sorry, it took me a second to get to the mute button.
Sure.
Yes, so first, I just want to say I do hear George's point, but Maine has a variety of different locations. And I look at a place like where I come from, Hollowell, where we don't have the active farming, but our prime farmland is a very limited resource. And so I guess I would hope that this group does focus on a place like that and worry about the land, even if it's not an active farm. And George may be right that there are parts of the state where maybe a different outcome from, or a different policy recommendation from this group might be appropriate as far as how that potential farmland is managed compared to active farmland. But there are other places of the state like mine, Kennebec County, where that soil is important, even if it's not actively farmed.
Let me just also reflect something else, in part in response to you, George, but I think it's a good reminder to everyone that at the first meeting, there was an overall framework that was presented to say that there are a number of potential avenues to tackle this issue. One is regulatory, statutory, one is incentive-based, and one is best management practices based or voluntary guidance. And the outcome of that meeting, as I understood it, and you all can correct us if we were wrong here, is that there was a general feeling that best management practices exist currently and that they alone are likely to be insufficient to address this issue. And so where it appeared to be the logical point to go next is, let's understand the current regulatory framework. So in my mind, it did make sense to have DEP present on what's the status of things right now. Where you go from there as a group is entirely up to you. If you would like to continue to focus on sort of statutory regulatory frameworks for the next couple of meetings, we can do that. If you think it would be more productive to be talking about sort of incentives or anything else, we can do that as well. But you need to be clear on what the current regulatory framework is. And that's the logic behind this meeting. I hope I don't sound offensive. I just want to give the framework for why we're doing what we're doing. And it's up to you where we go next. Go ahead, Patrick. I'm sorry, Jeremy.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to, and this is not in direct response to what you just said. I think I just wanted to kind of echo or maybe amplify a little bit what Nancy just said a moment ago. I want to make sure that we're having a contextual discussion. Having sort of seen this play out previously when wind power became popular in Maine about 10, 12, 14 years ago, everybody loves to talk about whatever the next technology is. And then the moment we start citing things, everybody's got all kinds of problems. So at a certain point, and I fully recognize and support there needing to be a balance, there does need to be a trade-off. If we are going to continue to ring the alarm bell about climate change and its horrific effects, and I believe those are real, and I want to do our part to make sure that Maine won't wait, and we've got a very real role to play here, but also recognizing we are a small state and we have a small number of residents and taxpayers and ratepayers. But we do need to be willing to accept some development pressures and trade-offs, and I don't think it can always be this, well, wind power is great until it's not. Solar power is great until it's not. Offshore wind is great until it's not. We're very effective as a society of fearing change. And then the moment we start to feel change, we say, we can't do that. We've got to run in a new direction. So I'm not really hearing that necessarily here, but I do just want to caution us to make sure that we are diagnosing a very real problem and then proposing very real, meaningful solutions that still allow clean, renewable energy projects to be cost-effectively sited, financed, developed, and become operational to the benefit of everybody who lives and recreates here. And sometimes I feel like we kind of lose sight of that and we start focusing on only the negatives, only, well, this is going to change the way we've done this, this is going to change the way we've done that. There does need to be some acceptance of change. Again, that doesn't mean that we say, great, build it anywhere and everywhere. I've said for a long time, it needs to be appropriately sited and sized. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to identify here is what is appropriately sited, what is appropriately sized. But I'm probably stating the obvious, but I just kind of want to put it out there. I lose patience when we run in one direction for 2 years and then we run in another one for 2. We either have to commit to these types of projects and this industry and its importance to not just our environment, but also our economy, or not. We send very mixed signals over and over in this industry. And I've been in renewables for 13 years. Matt's been there for longer, and I'm sure others of you have been in your areas of expertise for similar time periods. But I've just seen us do this a couple of different times across a couple of different administrations. And I just want to make sure that we bear that in mind. And as we're having these conversations, that it is framed in that context. It's not an either or. There's going to be a piece for all of us, or a role for all of us to play.
Point taken. Thank you, Jeremy. Ellen.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say that, and I'm sorry, Jeremy, that because I think some of the conversation from the last meeting might have sort of alleviated some of your concerns. Not to say that's not like a criticism of you. I'm just pointing that out because I think most of the folks here understand that this is not a black or white issue, right? We're not going to have a situation where no farmland is developed with respect to solar, or we don't lose any important habitats or forest land. I mean, I think all of us understand that there are going to be trade-offs in either direction, and that we have to sort of figure out where those trade-offs should be, where we can find mechanisms to create greater balance, like in the dual use context. But this is really tricky because there are climate and economic benefits in both sectors, right? I mean, our local food system is really important, particularly as we see other regions of the country greatly impacted by climate change. And that puts into question the ability, how much food production is going to happen in other parts of the country moving forward. So there is sort of this desire to re-regionalize our food system as well, which is also reflected in the Climate Action Plan. Obviously, renewable energy is so important to our climate goals, and both are really important to the development of Maine's economy. So I think that's maybe some of what Nancy was indicating, right, is that it's not going to be no development on 700,000 acres, but it's also not going to be let's develop any ag land there is, right? And so I really appreciated the mapping tool that Sarah has been trying, and the rest of the folks at Maine Audubon have been trying to put together, because it has that red light, yellow light, green light framework, which I think is important, and probably sort of an important framework for us all to be thinking about. Like, what are the things we absolutely want to avoid? Where's the sort of yellow category, right? Where it's, proceed with some caution, but probably going to see some development there. And where are the like win-win for everyone, green light, let's like move ahead. And how do we incentivize those projects? Like, how do we make sure that there's the greatest support possible, whether it's regulatory efficiency, whether it's financial incentives for moving those projects forward?
Thank you. I'm aware that both George and Patrick have their hand up. I also want to know what time it is, and that we have made a commitment to the public to hear public comment to the extent that there's an interest in doing so of any public member. So I'm going to shift to that for a moment and see if any. So Ethan, can you tell me, is there the ability to raise hands as attendees, non-panelists?
Yes, attendees are able to raise their hands.
Okay, great. So if there is any attendee who's not a work group member who would like to make a comment, Rodney, go right ahead. I'll unmute you. You go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to just be involved and respond today. I'll try to be brief and just give a quick background. My name is Rodney Kelshaw. I'm a managing partner at a small environmental consulting company in Yarmouth called Flycatcher LLC. I've been in consulting since '98, so I'm a wetland scientist, soil scientist, wildlife biologist, site evaluator, CPESC certified for erosion and sediment control. So working at small companies, I've had the opportunity to work and do a lot of different parts of projects. And so I've been listening in. I listened in last week, and I just wanted to weigh in on a couple of different things. One is something that George had brought up regarding prime farmland soils and sort of the distinction between what's being used and what falls under the definition. And I think for the panel, it might be helpful to have or invite somebody from the USDA NRCS to give a presentation to the panel about the definition of prime farmland soil and how they physically do that mapping. I know as a soil scientist going out and sometimes trying to verify if an area is prime farmland or not. I've had discussions with the NRCS staff and we've all laughed and gone, it's not that simple to just go out and say, yes, it is, or yes, it isn't, because they have certain, even lab data and other criteria that goes into how they put those lines on the face of the earth. And then, then the question is, well, great, that was done at a higher scale level. Now, how do we say if the soil where they want to put this solar project or whatever type of project, does it actually exist there? We know it's somewhere close, but where they're trying to site these things, is it there at all? And it's not as simple as most people think it would be. It's not impossible, but it kind of goes back to some of the other discussions is, how much cost and effort do you want to be putting onto the developers or the farmers, and sort of what's an appropriate level. I've done work in Vermont with there's Section 284 and Act 250. So it's their type of permitting that's analogous to what Nick was discussing earlier. And when you read through their plans, they have some really good, you read through and go, oh, this is a comprehensive way to determine how a project might impact these prime farmland soils. But then again, when you're asked to sort of meet these criteria, they're extremely arduous. So again, it goes back to how much data do you actually need to protect what you're trying to protect and not cost somebody a bunch of money, but make sure that it's an appropriate use for that site. And if you can maybe change something on site, but still allow a project, but protect some farmland in the process, then I think, those are the types of things we're trying to do. And sometimes you can do that without having these really arduous steps to go through. So when you're talking about looking at other states and what they're doing, I think it's important to, like I said, look at those other states, see what those sections say, and maybe try to pick pieces out and then find out, is that too much? What's appropriate? And so I'll sort of bring that back around to, I'm also part of the Maine Association of Professional Soil Scientists. And I think I agreed to be the president of the association next year. I'm not sure, but if somebody forgets, then maybe I can back up. I don't know. But as an organization, we dig lots of soil pits over the entire state, trying to help projects fulfill the site law application and stormwater sections. And we do it all over the state. And we find some interesting things, but I think that organization could also be helpful as part of this process, that we might be able to help answer questions regarding, does something seem arduous, or does that make sense? Or maybe is there another way to get to the answer? Can we answer a question maybe going at it from a different direction?
Got it. Okay.
Technical committee that could help do something like that. And I'll just sort of wrap it up. Something that Matt had mentioned earlier is, whether it be this or back in the day when we kept going back in front of the legislature regarding changing vernal pool habitat setbacks and things like that. I understand that for the applicants, they really want two things. They want predictability. So when you apply for a permit, you know what you're getting yourself into. But then when you come to a snag, you also want flexibility. So you don't have to go through giant steps you don't need to. And the problem always exists is when you increase predictability, you seem to decrease flexibility. And it's not great, but it just is, I think. And so that's something to consider through the process as well.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment. Let me just check if there is anyone else on the public line that would like to comment, and then we'll circle back to committee. Okay. George, let me take your comment.
I wanted to address the point about balance between the possibility that we're going to have more food production here in Maine versus the needs for clean renewable energy generation. Even today, where we stand right now, we are just getting to the point from a climate standpoint where farms in Arizona are only now just losing their irrigation rights from the Colorado River. There is a lot of fresh water and a lot of farmland between here and Maine. Okay, there's a lot of fresh water in the Great Lakes. There's a lot of farmland in New York and Pennsylvania that is very, very viable. Okay, the New England Independent System Operator, okay, if we want to get coal and if we want to get greenhouse gases reduced, and if we want to get reduced climate impact from power generation, the New England ISO has to have more renewables coming in, or we have to go outside the New England ISO and do things like bring in hydropower from Quebec, with all the attendant impacts that implies. So if I were to look at the two problems, I would say, yes, there's going to be there's going to be some return of food coming into Maine and so on and so forth. But if we do not find a way to deliver clean megawatts into the New England ISO, we will be forced to generate power using thermal sources that create greenhouse gases. So between the two, I would say the electrical production issue has some significant constraints. And furthermore, it has geographic constraints, which agriculture and farming are much more flexible on. So my concern is if I want to try and displace greenhouse gases, if I want to try and end the use of coal in the New England ISO, the way we're going to do that is clean solar power coming from land-based sources in Maine. I think offshore wind has problems. I think wind production has problems, but solar on the ground in Maine is one of the cheapest ways to make that stuff. So those are my thoughts about how to balance that.
Patrick.
Thank you. So this group, we leaned hard into dual use and the shared use of land today, and I love it. I'm excited about that. I think that's the gold standard that we can hope to reach for. But I also think that when I hear all new development in Massachusetts is the dual use, I don't think that's the solution for Maine. I think that will create problems where other demand on that land, other pressure for that land, suburbanization will wind up permanently removing that land. And I know Fortunato sagely cautioned us against, necessarily viewing solar fields as a placeholder, on a generational level. But when we start looking at multi-generation or like how the land looks 100 years from now, as well as this well managed under the solar panels, then I think that there is a place for just the traditional solar development on ag land. And I don't want to lose track of that as we go into our next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to do sort of popcorn style, just final comment from every single one of you on this group that what you would like to make sure is covered at the next meeting in terms of focus or any piece of information. Just I'm going to walk through each one of you just so that we get it down. So first, Nick.
I think we can produce data on farmland loss in the state of Maine, and I think we can produce that data in the United States. I actually tend to disagree. There's not a lot of farmland between here and Arizona. It's diminishing, and there's not a lot of fresh water. We're losing fresh water. So I just have to overtly disagree with some of those statements. However, I think there's lots of areas where there can be consensus on how we craft what it looks like in Maine, and I think that these tensions are a necessary part of doing that.
Thank you, Nick. So again, question is information or focus for the next meeting? Brief as possible. Emily.
I would go with Nick's, but to add, I think another layer to the conversation would be the technical potential on the brownfields that are available in Maine, and perhaps even the technical potential for rooftop as a comparison for how much will probably be directed to greenfields.
Great. Okay, thank you. Heather, are you still on the line? No, we don't. Okay. If I've missed you, just jump right in. Ellen, go right ahead.
Yeah, I echo what others have said. I would also say it was helpful to look at some of the case filings related to some of the projects that have made it through the first tranche. But I'm just wondering, when you look through those, there's not like a ton of detail about the projects themselves, what types of land it's occupying. And I just am wondering if there's some way to provide some summary information so that we get a better sense of for the projects that have moved forward, where they're located.
Great, thank you. Sarah.
I'll actually respond to some of those. I am happy to bring some of these numbers next time. Again, with the new files that I just got, I don't have the numbers, but in terms of where development is going. And to that question, Ellen, on the first tranche projects, only 2 of them have gone all the way through DEP. 2 are in early consultation with DEP, and all the rest, I have town information, and that's it, because I really wanted to be able to pull that info. And I agree with the earlier comment that knowing what can't, I really would like to hear from developers what can and can't be done on some of these, parking lots, roofs, brownfields. What are those limitations? I heard a couple of years ago that of the 400 landfills, only 2 of them were big enough to be used for development. Is that the case? And what is that size?
Okay, great. Thank you. Caitlin.
Yeah, I love what I'm hearing in terms of getting to the really root of the data on what's being proposed, on what type of land and what are the actual impacts we're going to see. And once we kind of are on that common understanding, maybe by the next meeting or the next meeting, I would love to land on kind of what kind of product this group is going to be producing and kind of start working towards, who's writing what and what we're proposing coming out of this.
Great, thank you. Matt. Sorry, you still on the line? No. If you find you are, you can jump right in. Skipping over Fortunate. George.
Yeah, I think definitions are really important. And I think that probably the biggest risk we have right now is using out-of-state definitions. It's not that they won't work, it's just that we may have definitions of farmland here in Maine, in particular in our tax law, that could be really helpful. So I think that's kind of my, I think that could trip us up, and also using Maine-based law and Maine-based definitions could be really helpful.
Great, thank you. Jeremy. He is off the line. If I'm mistaken, you can jump right in. Andy.
I agree with a lot of what I've already heard. Just as I already said, more information about, what sort of acreage are we talking about expecting for solar development, so we really know how big or small of an issue we're going to be dealing with in the coming years in terms of, or not problem, or I didn't say problem, issue. Yes, just what is the scope of this potential development, and yeah, just continuing to, figure out these definitions of what dual use is. And I agree, with the sentiment that we need to have a broader term of dual use perhaps than what they have in Massachusetts, and that Maine is a very different state when it comes to our land base and our agriculture. And I guess I do just want to say, this isn't really the question, but I do just want to echo, those concerns too, though. It's like, as a farmer, when I look out at the agricultural landscape, I'm very concerned about losing farmland, and I'm very concerned about that access to farmland for beginning farmers and young farmers. I do also generally see a lot of retirement age or past retirement age farmers who don't have a whole lot of really good options. And I am really hesitant to put, you know, the sort of really heavy restrictions on it that has been done in Massachusetts.
Got it.
As often, you know, housing or other development will happen. At the same time, we need to do something in terms of development. Yeah. So much to talk about. That's all.
Thank you. Julianne.
I think I would really appreciate some clarity, you know, outside of our scope, but just there's a saturation point for solar development in Maine. There are a limited number of solar developments that can be created. So if I could have some clarity about what that number is, what does that look like in Maine? Or, you know, is there only, you know, 45,000 sites that could possibly be developed, period? And how many of those sites have already been created? So I think that would help me to understand better what the need is for solar development going forward in Maine. And then we can look at a little more closely how that relates to existing farmland that's in productive farm use.
Thank you all. My apologies, we are over time. Your next meeting is Thursday, July 22nd, same time of day. All of the meeting dates are in your meeting packet on page 3. We will be back in touch shortly with content. Nancy.
I just asked, I'm still fascinated and think it's really important to be digging into the economics. George mentioned property taxes. So, you know, let's not lose that. We don't want the unintended consequences to boomerang back here. And the incentives situation, I mean, that's like Greek to me. I'll admit to that. And if there's any resources folks want to send our way to bone up and get a little bit smarter when we have these conversations about incentives, I'd really appreciate that, because if we're pro dual use, whatever the ultimate definition is, how can we be creative in Maine to make that feasible from an economic standpoint? I think that's worth a discussion further on. And I'm done.
Great. Sorry, Nancy, for overlooking you. I was going through the stakeholder list and the co-chairs were in a different category. Great. Thank you all. We'll be in touch soon. Appreciate your time. Nancy, do you have a time for a phone call?